Brenda, should we go ahead and get started?
Yeah, I think so. People will probably still trickle in for the
I
next
like
few
trickle
minutes,
in.
but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So thanks you guys for joining us, and definitely feel free to either interrupt or use the chat function. I just was planning to kind of go through some tips that I have about writing clinical research proposals, especially K proposals, but I'll probably go through things for maybe like 20 minutes or half an hour and then leave time open for discussion at the end, because we definitely prefer for these to be more interactive sessions and answer questions that you all may have as you're currently working on your proposals. So I wanted to start by just saying that K grants are career development awards, and this seems so blatantly obvious, but it's something that I think people occasionally lose sight of as they're working on their K proposals. They It's easy to get really focused on the science and what you're doing and focus on the scientific parts of the proposal, but you have to remember that K grants are a very special type of grant for the NIH, and they really are all about developing your career. And so it's important to never lose sight of that, even when it comes to the scientific parts of the proposal. And so you're not just trying to convince the reviewers that your scientific experiments are important and that your approach is good, but you're also really trying to convince the reviewers that the NIH should invest in your career. And so what we're looking at as reviewers are these sorts of things that I've listed here. So do you have a real vision for your career and how this award will help to launch that? Do you have the right mentors who have the correct skill sets, who are going to really help you succeed and seem motivated to help you succeed? Are you in the right environment, a supportive environment? Do you have a chair that's going to help support you through the next stages of your career? And then the other thing that's really important, and always a bit of a fine line with K proposals, is the fact that you need to demonstrate that you need training. So you're not yet independent as an investigator, but that you're on the path to independence. And so that piece is always a bit of a fine line. It gets even more of a fine line when you're applying for a KO2, which is also a career development award, but one for independent investigators. And so you have to prove that you're actually an independent investigator, but you still need some training. And so that's just something else to keep in mind as you're putting together a K proposal. And I think it's helpful also just to think about sort of the full spectrum of your career in child neurology, your academic career, as you're thinking about your K application. So I just wanted to point out the components of the K-12 application in particular, which you guys have all seen, but it's worth just kind of taking a look at this in terms of the balance of the pages. Like when you actually look at like the pages that you're expected to compile as part of your K-12 application, you can see specific aims, 1-page research plan, 4 pages. But then these other things, career development plan, 3 pages, mentor statements, 3 pages, your bio sketches, all those other things are really important. And so when you think about the balance, all of these pieces are important, but don't forget that the career development plan is key, the mentor statements are key. So it's really important to pay attention to all of these. I think it's easy for people to get really focused in on their research plan and not spend as much time on the other pieces. But just want to point out that when you kind of look at the balance in terms of what reviewers are looking at in terms of the scientific components versus more the career development components, you can see that they're both really important. And so you want to really put equal attention into those other pieces and not give those short shrift, because otherwise you're undermining your own application. So every piece is definitely critical, but you've probably heard over and over that you should spend a lot of time on your aims page, and that the aims page is the one page that you will write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. And I would say that that's absolutely true for a K application as for any other grant application, that the aims page is still really key, because that ultimately frames your whole application for the reviewers. And when you think about how NIH grants are reviewed, if you guys are familiar with that, in general, you have some primary reviewers that will read the whole thing. And then there's this whole group of reviewers that are part of the study section, and this is true for the K-12 as well. And the rest of the reviewers are going to, they have their primary grants that they're assigned to, and then they look at all the other grants more superficially. And so they'll often focus on the aims page. And so those aims pages then really do kind of frame the proposal for the other reviewers who are also scoring your grant. So it's definitely important to pay a lot of attention to those aim pages for sure, and get lots of advice on those aims pages, and don't feel badly if you revise those a dozen times over. I still spend most of my time on my aims pages more than anything else. So, but the other thing just to keep in mind with the K applications in particular is that, again, because this is a career development award, the aims should not just be scientific, but also related to career development. And so on that aims page, if it's a pure research proposal, your aims are all just scientific. But in a K proposal, your aims page should also allude to your overall career development and how this proposal is going to help you achieve your goal. That's a career goal. And so make sure to mention that in your aims page as well. Still, the bulk of the aims page is going to be scientific, but often at the end, there should be a few statements about how achieving these scientific aims with this project will also help you towards this overall career development aim. So make sure to mention that. So I also just want to kind of pause for a moment, since I'm specifically talking about clinical research, to just say that being a clinical researcher means different things to different people, and there are many different sort of modes of clinical research. And so I tend to kind of break it down into sort of this spectrum between the academic clinician versus the clinical scientist. And so when I say the academic clinician, there are a lot of people that are doing important work that are predominantly clinical. And so they might be 75% clinical and maybe 25% academic. And within that academic time, they're doing some teaching, also some clinical work, but they're funded mostly through clinical work and in a clinical faculty track. And then the other end of the spectrum is what I would call the clinical scientist, who's majority research, funded mostly through research grants, and minority clinical work. And then there are people who are doing something in between. And I just want to point this out because it's important to keep in mind that K grants really aim to develop clinical scientists. And so it's important to make it clear that that's what you're aiming for. Sometimes I've read some proposals where it seems a little bit murky what people have in mind when they talk about being a clinical researcher. And, are they really intending to have the bulk of their efforts through their academic career be research related? And so it's good to be very explicit about what you mean when you say that you want to be a clinical researcher. And keep in mind that the K grants are really wanting to develop clinical scientists. And so, of course, a K grant requires you to be 75% research and 25% clinical. And that's in part because that's important for your academic career development, that when you finish your clinical training, that then you really focus on developing your research career. And then often over time, that balance might change for somebody who's a clinical scientist. Their research component might decrease a bit, maybe closer to 60% research or 50% research as they take on other tasks. But certainly at the beginning of your career, you want to be majority research focused if you're applying for a K grant, and that would be kind of your goal for at least, you know, the first like 5 to 10 years of your career, that you would want to indicate that you intend to be predominantly research effort. The other thing I always like to mention, because I feel like I made some mistakes along this line early on, is that it's really important to follow your inspiration. And sometimes you get a little bit sidetracked by what's feasible, some kind of low-hanging fruit perhaps that would just be a little bit easier to focus on for your research efforts. But I really learned that that it's virtually essential to be passionate about what you are planning to do. Both because it shows in your grant proposal. So when you write a grant, when you read a grant as a reviewer, you can tell who's really excited about their work and who's just not quite so excited. And so you want that sort of excitement and your inspiration to solve these problems be transparent in your grant. So you have to be excited about it. And the other thing is that it's actually really painful to commit to doing a project that you're not excited about. And so that has happened to me. There was a foundation grant that I wrote early in my career, and I was encouraged to do it by some mentors who just felt like, oh, this would be an easy study to do and easy to get funded. They're right, it was easy to get funded, and I hated the project. And the project was really painful to complete because I was just never really passionate about that particular project. So try to follow your inspiration and really let your clinical practice, I think, guide what you're doing from a research basis, because that's what will really keep driving you and inspiring you. If you have patients that are in front of you and you're seeing them in the hospital or in clinic, and they're presenting you with a question that you feel needs to be answered, and you're looking in the literature and there's no answer, then that will drive you and inspire you and keep you going, especially when you get the rejections, because everybody gets rejections. And there have been so many times where I've been rejected and felt like, oh, I can't believe this. What should I do? Well, what do I do? Like, the patient's still coming to clinic or coming to the hospital with the same problem. That problem hasn't gone away. And so it helps me to kind of pick back up and keep going and keep trying to seek that funding or get that paper published, because I feel like it's important for my patients and I owe it to them. So tying it in with your clinical program and letting your patients inspire you, I think is definitely really critical. And then have that show through in your grant proposal. And so, like, again, in your aims page, in your career development page, really share that sort of vision and inspiration, and put that vision in your K proposal for how you are going to use your career and this career development award to transform your field of interest. So, you know, I think have a vision, think big, be aspirational, and then make that come across in your K proposal. And then stay focused. You know, I think follow your inspiration and then kind of try to stay focused on your inspiration. sometimes people will get convinced by somebody to get involved in something that's completely unrelated. So say you're a movement disorders neurologist, and then somebody convinces you to do something, say, related to a neuromuscular disorder that has absolutely nothing to do with any sort of movement disorders, and you know participate in some publication or write some paper that's completely unrelated. In this early stage of your career, those kind of publications, especially if you don't have a lot of publications yet, a completely unrelated publication sometimes can actually do more harm than good, because it suggests that you're not totally committed to this area of research, and and that maybe you're a little bit unfocused, and that you're having trouble kind of deciding exactly what you want to do. So be mindful of that. Sometimes people feel like any publication is better than no publication at all, but I think that's not always quite the case. Some unrelated publications can actually be a little bit of a red flag to a reviewer. So keep that in mind, and don't forget that you can say no to things. It can be hard to say no, especially if the person who's asking you is somebody that you really respect, and they're asking you to write a review article or something like that. But you can tell them that you got the advice that you need to stay focused, and that you shouldn't write that review article about something completely unrelated to your career goals. So the other thing that I think is just important, again, like, this is a career development plan, so, or a career development proposal with a career development plan. So really be thoughtful about this. And I do feel like when you're writing grants, you should think of it as an opportunity to really do some self-reflection, and really decide what's important to you and what you want to pursue. So don't think of writing a grant as just like an exercise to get money. Think about it as really an opportunity to sit back and think about what you want to do with your life. And so, especially with these career development awards, I think it's important for your starting point for the grant to actually be, where do I want to be in 10 years? And then make sure that everything follows from that, and sort of kind of like, once you pin that down, what you want to be in 10 years, and have that be kind of a common theme throughout the proposal, so that whether it's your aims page or your career development plan or the research plan, you're kind of consistently referring back to this sort of like overall vision. Because I think if your vision for your career comes throughout the proposal, and then also throughout things like your bio sketch, the personal statement of your bio sketch, through your mentor's letters and things like that, if it's clear that you have this vision for what you want to do with your career, that is really strong, and reviewers are really attracted to that for these sort of career development proposals. So what do you want to be in 10 years? Like, what do you want to be able to say? Or like at the end of your career, when it's your legacy that you're looking back on, what do you want to be able to say, like, I was, or I did this? And so, for me, if I'm kind of like thinking back, like what I would have been, or what I did write when I was like writing K grants, like for me, I really wanted to be a pediatric stroke neurologist who is developing new strategies for stroke prevention in children. And so then once you kind of like state that's who you want to be, whatever that is, then think through, how will this research award help me to get there? And how will the K-12 lead to a K-23 or K-02, and then ultimately to an R01. So, this is an NIH funding program, and so we tend to think about it then along the lines of kind of the NIH funding pathway. And then really trying to make that clear throughout the K proposal. And so for me, since my ultimate goal was actually to develop strategies for secondary stroke prevention in children, my initial goals then for my early stages of my career were around identifying predictors for recurrent stroke in children. And because this has a training component, my training then should include coursework on clinical trial design, because ultimately, if I want to do secondary stroke prevention in children, it would make sense for me to do some basic sort of mechanistic work, understanding risk factors, and then ultimately do a clinical trial for stroke prevention. So I'm going to do the epidemiologic work I need to do with my research project, and then the training will also set me up for my long-term goal, which would be to do some stroke prevention clinical trials. So that's what I mean about kind of like pinning down your 10-year goal, where you want to be in 10 years, and then having everything else kind of feed into that in sort of a consistent way. So get that training while you can. Whatever you need to do now that will make you a better candidate for your R. So once you get beyond the K proposals and then you're on, you're proposing research proposals like the R01s, you no longer have that training option. So you actually want to be really thoughtful about what kind of training you can do now while you're on your K award. It's kind of a special time. You're done with your clinical training, and now you can really focus on the additional research related training that you need to lay that groundwork for the research proposals that you would be writing in the future. And then while you're doing all of this self-assessment and kind of coming up with your own plan for your K award, I think it's a really good time to be meeting with your division chief and department chair, sharing this vision with them, inspiring them, sharing your inspiration, showing them that you're a really inspired young faculty person. And then also, that's a good time to determine whether your plan fits ultimately with their vision for the division and the department. Because again, as you're thinking about your long-term plan, you also want to know, are you in the right environment for that? Does your plan fit with the vision that the chair has for your department? So it's just a good opportunity to, while you're thinking about your career goals, to then go communicate that with the leaders in your program. So so stay connected with them, and again, see this as an opportunity. So, and like I said, propose the training, get the training. One thing that kind of will come across sometimes with clinical research proposals in particular is a little bit of this assumption that by going to medical school, you would kind of know how to do clinical research. But many medical schools don't specifically train medical students to perform clinical research, and it's actually not intuitive. So if you want to be a clinical scientist, you should say that you need training in clinical research. And now I would say that for a lot of research grants, to be competitive, it's almost a requirement to have some sort of formal training in clinical research. And I did do a master's in clinical research while I was on the K-12. I was on the child neurology K-12. And I found that every single grant that I wrote in the first like 10 years of my career, the reviewers always commented on my master's degree. And so that I could tell was important to the reviewers who were reviewing my grants, that I had that sort of formal training. And certainly it's something that now when I'm a reviewer looking at K proposals, I look to see, does that applicant recognize that if they want to have a career in clinical research, they need some sort of formal training? And so formal training in designing clinical research, formal training in outcomes metrics, formal training in biostatistics and data analysis. And so the other thing that will definitely be a red flag to reviewers is if they do see somebody who has a background as a basic science PhD who's now proposing to do a clinical research study that without any sort of mention about training in clinical research. So it's totally fine if somebody has a basic science PhD and now they want to pivot to doing clinical research. That's completely fine. And in fact, you can leverage that in your K proposal by saying, I have this great background in research methodology, doing these things in, an animal model, for example, but now I want to pivot to doing more clinically focused research or translational research. But I realized that there's a different skill set to perform research in humans, and therefore I need this additional training in clinical research, and I need to understand how to measure biases, and I need to understand the best types of outcome metrics in humans and things like that. So you can actually use that to your advantage. And so by saying that you need that training in clinical research, you can convince the reviewers like, oh, this is a good candidate for this K grant because this is somebody who's got some strong research background, but now just needs a few more tools to be able to pivot towards doing clinical research. So use that, don't ignore that. So certainly, like I said, the career development piece is really important, but then obviously you also need to find the right research question. And these finer criteria for good research questions are ones that I actually learned when I was doing my master's in clinical research. And Steve Hulley was one of the professors of epidemiology here and wrote this book called Designing Clinical Research. And this was something that they presented. And I still use this and still think about this. So the finer criteria, feasible. Feasibility is a big, big, big issue for K grants because you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of time, and you're really trying to accomplish a lot in a small amount of time. So make sure that what you're proposing is feasible. So really paying attention to things like sample size. Do I have an adequate number of subjects? If you don't have enough power to answer your research question, then you need to be clear about that. Don't try to hide that. Don't try to pretend like you would have enough an adequate sample size. It's better just to be really upfront about that and say that, my ultimate goal is to determine whether this is a predictor of this particular outcome. But that will ultimately, because I study a rare disease, be the focus of my R01 when I will do a multi-center study of this particular disease. And so with this K grant, I plan to lay the groundwork for that R01 that will have the adequate sample size, and I will use my single center cohort to basically do some exploratory things and determine feasibility of this particular approach or things like that. So just be really realistic about what you're proposing. In child neurology, we study a lot of rare diseases, and so the reviewers are going to be sympathetic to that, if you're studying some sort of rare form of muscular dystrophy, you're not going to have an adequate sample size with a K proposal. But you can still say that you're going to do something that's meaningful, that will lay the groundwork for a later study that would have the sample size that you need to really answer your question of interest. So be realistic about what you can accomplish. And then, paying attention to all of these other feasibility issues as well, making sure it's accomplishable within the time frame of the grant. That's another thing where people will get hung up because they'll be so motivated to answer a particular research question. They'll try to fit it all in, and they struggle to get the sample size, so they'll say, well, I'll enroll 10 patients a year for 5 years, so that's 50 patients. but then realistically, you can't actually expect to be enrolling on day one. And if you're measuring outcomes, it doesn't make sense to continue enrollment until the end of a 5th year or something like that. So be really realistic about the time frame and make sure that everything's manageable in scope, because everything can sound really great, but if you have a lot of holes when it comes to feasibility, that can really sink a proposal. So obviously interesting, novel, ethical, which is always a challenge for us in child neurology because we're studying children. And so we do have to be really thoughtful about things like, can you really expect to get those blood samples if you're studying a bunch of toddlers with some particular disorder? How are you going to get around some of those ethical considerations about phlebotomy and children, or the need for anesthesia, things like that? And then obviously relevance is always important for a research question. And then again, for a career development proposal, specifically you want to address relevance to your career development. So not only is it relevant in terms of the scientific knowledge it'll bring, the clinical health of your patients, to future research, but specifically to your career development. So make sure that this research question that you're addressing is laying the groundwork for your future career. And then this is always like a funny one that I learned when I was in my early training for clinical research. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I don't know if you guys have heard this one before. I always thought like it was such a silly thing to say, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Like what a weird thing to say. But the funny thing is that I have used this over and over, and like I will be writing a grant and this will pop into my mind. KISS, keep it simple, stupid. So I actually think that this was one of the more useful things that I had heard, and maybe just because this acronym just kind of stuck in my head, but it actually is really important. Keep it simple. Like, it's very tempting to be overly technical, to like insert a lot of jargon into a grant proposal, and you kind of want to look smart, and so you want to like make it sound really smart and make it sound kind of complicated. But remember, like, this is where the empathy piece becomes really important. Remember that your reviewers are human. They're often really tired. They're overworked. They're all researchers too, kind of struggling with their own grant deadlines and stressors and things like that. Invariably reviewers are people who at the time they were asked to review, they're like, yeah, absolutely, I'm really excited about doing that. And then when they actually have, all these grants in front of them that they have to read, they're suddenly like regretting that they agreed to do this. And they're like, oh, I'm really tired. So make it like simple for them to read, make it appealing for them to read, make it kind of interesting for them to read. So just be empathetic towards those reviewers, and make it just something that's not overly complicated, not overly jargony, and just easy to follow. So keep it simple. Overly ambitious is probably one of the most common criticisms that is given to a K grant. And so I got this criticism when I wrote some K grants. And I remember when I first got this criticism, not understanding what that meant. I was like, overly ambitious? What? It's good for me to be ambitious. But what overly ambitious means is that it doesn't seem feasible. It seems like you're trying to bite off more than you can chew. So I always try to remind people when they're writing K grants that this is a marathon, not a sprint. You're not supposed to solve the problem with your K grant. The K grant is just the first step. You're laying the groundwork. You should be tackling the low-hanging fruit and then saving the hard stuff for your future directions. And so this again gets into some of that stuff about feasibility and sample size and things like that. So don't pretend like you're going to solve a problem that's vexed the field for the last 10 years with your K grant. Nobody expects you to. So be realistic and kind of propose something that will lay the groundwork for something that's super ambitious. Like, we want to know you're ambitious, but think about the fact that you don't have to accomplish all of your ambitions in the next 3 to 5 years. That's you have the arc of your career to do that. And so this should be just laying the groundwork, and then some of those other things that are not actually feasible during your K years, that then becomes your future directions. And this will lay the groundwork for an R01 that's going to be really ambitious. So think about it that way. So then other things, people sometimes will forget to actually put a justification of their sample size in their proposal. So don't forget to put that in there, because if you forget that, that's a big hole and a big red flag. And really support it with power calculations, to say that, this is my sample size, but not give any sort of justification for it, to support it with power calculations, is definitely a red flag. Again, like, nobody expects you to work magic, and especially if you're studying a rare disease, but you should just show that you're knowledgeable. So you should know if you're underpowered. That's really important. And if you're just underpowered and this is the best you can do, just acknowledge it and say, this is underpowered, but this is still important for me to do, because I'm going to learn all of these things in the process. And then I'm going to propose that multi-center study that's going to have adequate power. So just show that you're knowledgeable and that you're thoughtful and that you're seeing all the holes yourself. There's no perfect clinical research proposal. It's hard to study humans. You can't just order up more like you might order up some more mice. So just be knowledgeable about your own strengths and weaknesses of your proposal. And the more you show that you understand strengths and weaknesses, then the better off you'll be as your proposal's getting reviewed. So having a really solid analysis plan is also really important. Sometimes I get short shrift. I never totally understand why, but people will put a lot of detail into different pieces of their approach, but then kind of skimp on the data analysis piece. And it's important not to skimp on that, because you can spend all this effort collecting your data, but if you don't know how to analyze it correctly, then the reviewers are going to feel like, well, that's not really going to be worthwhile. Why should you spend all this effort collecting the data if you're not going to analyze it correctly? And so this is where it's important to make sure that on your mentorship team, you have somebody that can help you with the analysis piece, because we want to know that after all of that effort, it's not going to be just wasted by an inadequate analysis. So be really clear that you have the support that you need for your data analysis. And then definitely, this is another thing that I did not do well in some of my early grants. My limitations paragraph was too short. And I actually remember Donna Ferrero, who was one of my mentors, telling me once, like, take that paragraph on limitations and make that 2 pages, like 2 pages of your 12-page research plan. Really flesh out, limitations, anticipated problems or challenges, and then your potential solutions. And that's, I think, was such great advice that I got from her, because you want the reviewer to see that you understand all of your limitations, that you've thought through potential challenges, and that you already have in mind some solutions to problems that might arise. So this is another area where I feel like I never put as much attention as I should have, and a lot of proposals that I read now, I feel like kind of give a little bit too short of shrift to this particular piece. So really be mindful of that. So, and then I've alluded a few times to these mentorship teams. So really important to keep in mind, no one mentor or even 2 mentors will address all of your needs. It really should be a team. So find different mentors for different aspects of your scientific project. And they can be at other institutions. I think in general, as reviewers, we like to see that your primary reviewers or your primary mentor is at your institution, but certainly seeking different content experts, somebody who's an expert in your particular disease that might be at another institution, that can definitely be viewed as a positive. And occasionally we've even scored really well proposals where the primary mentor was at another institution, but they had a really solid plan for how they were going to communicate and engage with that mentor on a very regular basis. So if you have mentors at other institutions, know that the reviewers will be kind of like looking then to see, do you have a really well laid out plan for how you're engaging with that mentor who you won't be just like running into in the hallway. And then it's definitely ideal to have mentors whose interests intersect with yours but don't fully overlap. Your long-term goal is to kind of show that you're developing some independence, and so it's helpful to kind of indicate how you're kind of gaining these things from different mentors, but that ultimately you take all of these different little pieces and then become an independent investigator yourself. And keep in mind that you will never, as a clinical researcher, do research alone. So that will never happen. You will never do it all. You will always be collaborating with other people. That's just the nature of clinical research. And to me, it's part of the joy of clinical research. I love collaborating with people and working with other people. And so don't feel like ultimately you have to train in absolutely every little thing, because you will always be collaborating and working with other people who are bringing other strengths to the table. So don't feel like you have to cover everything and learn absolutely everything by the end of your K. So as you're working on your K proposal, remember to be a really good team player. Be a good team player as you're working on your K proposal. Be a good team player as you are then like on a funded K and doing those early studies. So really important to be a good mentee, and I think we do a whole other sessions on what it means to be a good mentee, but be respectful of your mentor's time, take notes, create kind of action items, and then follow up on those. And when you meet with your mentor again, show how you followed up on their advice. The one thing that annoys a mentor more than anything else is if they feel like they're repeating themselves at subsequent meetings because they say something and you don't hear it and then they have to say it again. So be respectful as a mentee. Be also a good collaborator just with other people, at your institution or in your field. Be generous, be fair, be transparent. Keep in mind that you're developing really long-term relationships. Child neurology is a small field, so these are people that you're going to work with. So be generous about authorship when you can, and kind of including other people, thinking about how you, even as a junior person, can support somebody else's career, maybe another junior person's career that you're collaborating with. So, be a good collaborator. And this actually serves you well with your own grant proposals, because then your mentors and collaborators are important for your future work. Like I said, you'll never be doing this work alone. You'll always need collaborators. So you want people who will want to work with you in the future, and then also to have their delight in working with you reflected in the letters of support that they're writing. So this can actually be quite clear when you read the letters. Like you can tell who's really excited to work with you and or work with the applicant, and who's like not so excited that they're kind of like, you agreed to write this letter of support, but I'm not really that excited. So be a good team player, and that'll really serve you well in the long run. And then definitely pay attention to details. Read those grant instructions super carefully and really early, and read them over and over and over and over. These review criterion, like often they're really detailed in an RFA, like a request for applications. But they're basically like almost like telling you like the secrets, like this is what the reviewers are looking for, and this is what they want you to say. And so you want to pay a lot of attention to that, and even just pick out the language that's in there to make it easy for the reviewers, because then the reviewers are basically looking for these criteria in your proposal. So you want to make it easy for them to find, because again, they're tired and they might miss something that you've written. And so just like by way of example, like this is kind of from our own, like the CNCDP career development plan criteria, and it talks about what you should put in your development plan, a gap-based plan. And so this is a little bit of jargon, but this is something that's in the RFA as kind of a criteria. So it's helpful to actually then use something like that, like to pick out some words that are in the RFA and then highlight that and say, this is my gap-based plan, bold, underline, colon. So then that stands out for the reviewer, like, oh, I'm looking for somebody's gap-based plan. Oh, there it is. So make it easy for the reviewer when you're kind of looking at these different criteria. And sometimes even like if there are numeric criteria where they say, demonstrate these things 1, 2, and 3, go in the same order. Assume that the reviewer is sitting there with their list of review criteria and they're sitting there with your proposal right next to it, and they're basically kind of going through a checklist. Make it easy for them to go through that checklist. So, and then again, just details, 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 ensure consistency between all the components. This is hard, especially because there's versioning as you change your aims and you change everything. But ultimately, you want to make sure that there's total consistency between your proposal, your career development plan, the mentor statement, the chair's letter. So if your career development plan says that you're meeting with your mentor twice a week, and then the mentor statement says they're meeting with you once a month, then that becomes a red flag. So that needs to be consistent. And then absolutely scour for typos, because any sloppiness just reflects badly on you as a scientist, because people think if you're sloppy writing your grant proposal, then you might be sloppy as a scientist. So that's a red flag. And then also just really pay attention to your personal statement in your biosketch. So that's the first paragraph of your biosketch. For some reason, a lot of times people just will have a pretty generic bio in there, and they'll just say, like, I'm a child neurologist who specializes in pediatric stroke, and fairly generic. The biosketch should always be personal for that personal project. And so that particular funding opportunity, like, why are you the right person for this particular funding opportunity? So really make the personal statement super personal. So other just general tips, I'm sure you've heard this before, just get lots of people to read it, including friends who are not in science or medicine, because you really do want to avoid this jargon. So jargon, I actually put in a definition of jargon: special words or expressions that are used by a particular profession or group and are difficult for others to understand. It's hard not to put in a lot of jargon. Sometimes people think jargon makes them look smart, but jargon as a reviewer is just like frustrating, especially if you're not in that particular field. And when you're writing K grants, you have to assume that the other people reviewing your grants, they might be child neurologists, they might be adult neurologists even, they might be neuroscientists. They're different reviewers, but they're not going to be experts in your subspecialty. And so if you use a lot of jargon, say that's like just going to be understandable to like a functional imaging expert, but somebody who's an epidemiologist and has no background in that is not going to understand, then it just kind of frustrates the reviewers, makes the reviewer feel kind of stupid, like, oh my God, should I know this? And I don't. So you don't want your reviewer to like read your grant and feel like self-doubts. You want them to like read your grant and be excited about it and happy as they're reading it. So again, kind of that keep it simple, stupid thing. And then the other thing I always try to do too is put aside my grant after I've written it, put it aside for a week or a couple weeks so that I kind of forget about it. I probably have a bad memory. And then I read it again and I'm like, oh my God, like, what? Why did I write that? What? That doesn't make any sense. And so like, I find that if I write it at the time, it totally makes sense to me. And I go back to it and I'm like, oh my God, that makes no sense. So go back to it and reread it after kind of putting it aside for a bit. And that helps you in terms of kind of that clarity. And then, like I mentioned before, make it visually attractive. Lots of just like some white spaces. It shouldn't be super dense. Add some figures, some flow diagrams. Again, kind of make it friendly for your reviewer. And then after all this work and putting together a really great proposal, just expect rejection. In your research career, you'll receive more rejections than acceptances. That is absolutely true. And you ultimately have to be thick-skinned. Read your reviews, put them away for a few days. Don't make any decisions on your first read of your reviews, and then go back and decide on next steps after you've had a couple days to recover. Invariably, I find I read the reviews and I'm like, those horrible people, how could they say that about my grant? And then I go back to the reviews a few days later and I'm like, oh, that wasn't so bad. Why did I think that that was so negative? And the positive things start to kind of like bubble up more, and the negative things don't seem quite as blooming and obvious. So put away your reviews for a couple days and then reread them before coming back to them. And then just don't give up. So if your patients need a question answered, then you owe it to them to keep figuring out how to get an answer. And so persistence is just ultimately so important here. And that's why, again, it just really helps if you know that that's an important research question and you're inspired to solve it, and these are your patients that you're taking care of that need that research question answered, that helps you to get through these rejections and helps you to kind of stay motivated to keep moving forward. Know all your funding options. NIH is not the only funding option, and actually having some other small grants can actually look really good on your proposal. So if you're writing your next step, like your K23 later, it helps to actually show that you've succeeded in getting some intramural awards or some other foundation awards. So keep that in mind. Like, be diverse with your portfolio and try to get other little grants as well. And then definitely pay a lot of attention to time management, especially email. Don't let your email rule you. Turn off email alerts, block out set times to check email. Email can be so consuming. And then, like I said, say no, do it judiciously. You need to be a team player, but if there's something that really is going to detract from your overall vision of who you want to be in 10 years, then definitely think about saying no to that. And then don't lose the forest for the trees. Again, kind of stay focused, but also don't just zoom in so far in the details that you kind of lose sight of the big picture of what you're trying to accomplish. Try to carve out some time every once in a while to sit back and think. And sometimes I force myself away from my desk and my computer, and I go sit like somewhere else, like on the couch, on a chair, somewhere else, to then just like think. And maybe I'll take a few review papers or something, some papers that I think might inspire me to think about my next research step, my next proposal that I might put forward. It helps to kind of step away from the computer and give yourself a little bit of protected time to just think and read some literature and take some time to be inspired. And then really just think about what makes research fun for you. And if it's not fun anymore, then try to get back to what makes it fun. So then I just wanted to finish with this Nelson Mandela quote that I think is so appropriate for us as researchers. I never lose, I either win or learn. So with every rejection that you get, think about it that way. It's a learning opportunity. Read those reviews that you get and then figure out how you can learn and make the best of those. But don't feel like it's ever a failure to get rejected, because you will get rejected, and that's not a failure. It's just part of the process. So I promised I would save time for discussion, and then I just kept talking, and so I did a terrible job of saving time for discussion. I'm so sorry. But do you guys have questions or things that you want to bring up, things that you've thought about as you've been working on your proposals?
It's Brenda. I just had a question about the role of a statistician. Like, where do they fall in these clinical grants? Like, for a K? Like, would you use them as a mentor? Or would you use them as a consultant? Like how?
Yeah, I think that that's a good question, Brendan, and you can share your thought on that as well. I think the most important thing is just to have a biostatistician. If you can, it's probably best to have them on your mentorship team. It's less expensive that way often. Like if they're on your mentorship team, they're not necessarily requiring effort or a budget for it. But you can also have budgeted for some biostatistics analysis time. That's probably a good thing to have in your budget. So maybe have a PhD biostatistician who's part of your mentorship team, but then perhaps also budget for kind of a master's level biostats data analyst to basically do some of the data analyses. But I think the most important thing is just to show that you have a biostatistician that's involved, somebody who's got those data analysis skills. I don't know, Brenda, what would you say?
I've only written I've written mostly basic science. Well, I only wrote a basic science K, but I was just curious because it's come up before for some of the people in my division about that role. And I was just kind of curious as what other people thought. You can ask questions, everyone. They're all on top of it, I guess.
Yeah. Shannon, do you want to share anything from your experience having gone through this? Like any tips that you would share, things that you thought of that maybe I didn't cover?
Well, my application is a basic science one, so that's like it's a little bit different. It's a lot different. But I think that I think if you have a good idea, in general, if you have a good idea and you're like timid about, applying, you should apply, because I think that as long as you have the time to sort of flesh out and think through thoughtfully what you want your application to look like, just because you get really, really valuable feedback too, just from the whole process.
Yeah, this year it is going to be virtual as well, so I'm sure you've already figured that out, but it is going to happen and it will be a retreat, so we hope there'll be a lot of good learning and feedback. So
yeah, and then you guys might have already figured this out, but one of the unique things about this K-12 proposal that's unlike a K-23 or K-08 is that you actually talk to your reviewers, your primary reviewers. And so that doesn't happen in a normal NIH study section. Normally you don't actually know who your primary reviewers are. You can see who's on the study section, but don't know who the primary reviewers are. But with this K-12, we always have the reviewers meet with you during the process to have the opportunity to directly ask questions that they had after reading your proposal, and to also have you have the chance to verbally say and explain why your research is important. And I guess one other thing I'll mention too, that some advice that I had heard before, is that your Ames page should be kind of like your elevator pitch. It's a little bit different from an elevator pitch in many ways, but I do like to think about that. Like I like to think about, like, if I ran into this philanthropist on an elevator and this philanthropist was like, oh, what are you working on? And I wanted to like explain to them in like 2 minutes what I'm working on and why it's important. That should come across in your Ames page. And so whatever those key things are that you would say in an elevator pitch, you want to make sure that those things come through in your Ames page. And some of those key things, like I actually will use like things like bolding and underlining to then, like, for some of those key phrases about this is why this work is high impact, I will actually then use some bolding and underlining to kind of like have those key things really come out in that Ames page. So it's more than an elevator pitch, but the elevator pitch should be kind of in there in that Ames page.
Hi, this is Danielle. I have a quick question from the CNCDP website. The components that, speaking to your point, Dr. Fullerton, about making sure you read the instructions carefully and address every single part. The research plan says that it should include a discussion of the significance, innovation, novelty, background, and proposed approach. Can you speak a little bit about difference, or how we should distinguish innovation and novelty?
Yeah, um, that's a good question, and maybe Brenda can help answer that too. So I think novelty obviously is probably more kind of related to the idea, the question, as you're answering something, that the information that you're gaining will be novel rather than just confirmatory. That it's not like somebody else has shown this already and you're just confirming it. You're obtaining some novel sort of information. Innovation, that tends to be a little bit more focused on kind of like the approach. And so the techniques that you're using, are the techniques innovative? And so, you know, like for instance, I have a funded grant that's looking at infectious triggers for stroke in childhood. And so something that was a novel question, nobody had really looked before at, you know, infectious triggers for childhood stroke. But then what was innovative was that I proposed to use next generation sequencing of nucleic acids of pathogens as a way of detecting the pathogens in the sample. So the novelty was the question, the innovation was the technique, the next generation sequencing.
That is super helpful, because this is something I've been struggling with in writing my proposal and figuring out what's the difference there. So thank you.
Brenda, would you agree with that? Do I have that right, or am I misinforming people?
No, I think that sounds exactly right. And I think that, you know, the innovation too is something that may carry you on to your R. Like if it's innovative and it's a good technique that you're learning or studying, then you may be able to move that into your R. And that's kind of important, I think, in a K, that it propels your career forward because you're learning some innovative technique.
Mm-hmm.
I just one other thing that I do want to point out about the meeting. So if you're on the edge about submitting yours, it's again what Heather said. You're building this community of child neurologists, and that really is something that I think comes through at the meeting. So you're all going to be part of this community, whether you get funded or not. So join us.
Yeah, definitely. So that's part of what we enjoy about these retreats. It'll be different this time since it'll be online, but I think we're still hoping to have a lot of these kind of like small group connections. And so where you connect with your reviewers, and then that really is an opportunity for you to get to know other people in the field.
So Josh just wrote, sometimes it might, well, can you see it, Heather?
Oh, sorry, I didn't have the chat thing open.
Oh no, it's fine. Oh, he doesn't have a microphone. How do you recommend balancing innovation with rigor and reproducibility? Huh? I see. Wow.
Yeah, I think one thought on that. So rigor and reproducibility is super important to the NIH. If you look on NIH websites, there are whole sections on rigor and reproducibility. The issue with the rigor and reproducibility is that historically there have been a lot of NIH-funded grants that had really interesting findings that were totally not reproducible. And so the NIH then really became interested in figuring out why that was, that certain things weren't reproducible, and then making sure that that became part of people's plans. And so one example then of kind of showing some rigor and reproducibility is to basically plan, especially in clinical work, you will do your novel work and have your novel finding, but then you need to have a plan to basically do something confirmatory. And so this is where we talk about derivation cohorts and validation cohorts. And so you might propose to derive something in your K proposal and then validate it in the next step with another proposal. It's often hard if you're studying more rare diseases to then be able to do derivation work, innovative work, and then do a validation step in the same process, because inherently to validate something, it needs to be in an independent cohort. It's hard enough to get the sample size you need for your primary study, much less to do a validation step. But then that needs to be something that you talk about, but then often can be talked about as a future direction or as a side collaboration. And so, you know, for instance, I derived a scoring system for focal cerebral arteriopathy, this childhood arteriopathy, in my research cohort. And then I collaborated with a Swiss investigator who had a Swiss pediatric stroke cohort to do a validation step in her cohort. So addressing that in your future directions can be really important, and it shows that you're really thoughtful. Like if you talk about rigor and reproducibility in a K proposal, that basically would be like a great sign of like maturity as an investigator, to know that that's something that's important that you need to address. And so to kind of say, in my next step, I will validate this, that actually can help to address that while still being feasible.
Heather, if I could just get a word in.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know that you should be thinking in terms of balancing innovation with rigor. They're not, it's not a balancing act. All rigor and reproducibility really refers to is doing things right and doing things well. And, you know, maybe validation is doing things right, but whatever is a reflection in terms of sample size or controls or whatever it is, using good scientific method so that people can take your work to the bank and we don't find out 3 years later that it was rubbish. And whereas innovation, you can be incredibly rigorous while being innovative, or incredibly rigorous being boring. You know, they're just different things. It's not a balancing act. You should always just be really rigorous and do things right. So whatever data you present, people know that they can count on it.
I'm wondering if one of Josh's concerns was also not even just reproducibility, but also, I mean, sometimes the innovative projects, they're innovative because people haven't tried that yet, which means there's a higher risk that you're going to come out with a big fat nothing to show after 2 to 3 years, and how to convince people this is a really cool idea that I can definitely really do. No, really, you know.
But so the reproducibility part of that is that when they do the same experiments in the same way, they come out with a big fat nothing also. And,
yeah,
you know, reproducibility, we're trying to move away from that term. NIH glommed onto it and is keeping it. You know, reproducibility, you can reproduce bad data too. That's sort of not the point. You know, the idea with reproducibility is that if you do things in the same way, you get the same results. But, you know, it's really about when you present data, can people count on it or is it wrong? It doesn't matter whether your ideas are right or wrong. It's about the data. You know, if you do it over and over again, you get the same data.
And for those of you who haven't opened the chat function, as I hadn't, opened the chat. Steve Korn made a couple other points in the chat, including the importance of making sure that the personal statements for the mentors is also personalized. And that's a good point, because that's often generic, that the mentors will submit bio sketches that just say something generic about what type of investigator they are. And so feel free to offer to modify those personal statements for your mentors and they, I'm sure, will take you up on that if they don't make it personalized themselves, because that personal statement of their biosketch should really talk about their experience as mentors and why they have the right skill set to be your mentor on this K grant. So that's a good point, that's really important, that those mentors biosketches also be personalized. Thank you, Steve, for mentioning that. Steve, anything else that?
Yeah, I just want to say something that is probably not going to be useful, but I'll say it anyway, because we're going through, we're heading towards council after the review, and we're looking at all the summary statements once again. And, we read lots and lots and lots of summary statements. And Heather, I think everything you said was spectacular. I thought everything's right on. And what's so hard to get across is that the goal is to be clear, and to be clear with the reviewers. You're not trying to hide anything. You're not trying to massage anything. It's not, you're not on TV. It's reviewers are constantly criticizing applications because they really just don't understand the point you're trying to make. How does the career development plan relate to the research? Why are you taking that course? Heather talked about using a gap-based plan, which you absolutely should do, but don't say you have a gap-based plan and then not give them a gap-based plan. And make sure the gaps you're filling in are what you need to be able to do this research, and explain to the reviewers why you're doing what you're doing. And the fault with the aims over and over again is these vague aims. I'm going to assess something. I'm going to look at something. I'm going to evaluate something. So what are you going to learn? What are you going to do? You're going to assess something. Hey, I'm going to take a look. And you really want to be clear in absolutely everything you write. Tell the reviewers what you mean. What are you talking about? We just have, again, we have summary statement after summary statement that, well, I don't really know what they mean by this. There's some language here. Is it good? Is it bad? Should we give them credit? Should we not give them credit? Be clear. Write clearly. It's not grantsmanship. Think clearly and write clearly. Right.
Hi, this is Danielle again. I have one more question, if you don't mind. Regarding the current draft that I have for my career development plan, actually has the, I appreciated Brenda Porter's webinar a couple months ago about what to include in a career development plan and taking that gap-based plan approach. And so I actually made the majority of content in my career development plan within a table where each row is one of the gaps, and then the columns are what I plan to do and how the mentor would support me through that. Have you seen other career development plans where it's mostly the majority of the content is organized in a table? And does that seem like it is a good idea or not a good idea?
Yeah, to me, that sounds like a great idea. I think I've seen some that have done it that way, and I always like it because to me it's very clear and easy to follow, because then I can just kind of look across the line, gap solution, gap solution, gap solution, and so it does make it easy to follow. So I like that. I think you don't have to do it that way. Some people can do it more text-based if it's more amenable to text, because it's a little bit more complicated to explain how your solution will fill a gap that you need more text. That's totally fine too. But I think, any sort of strategy for just making it super clear, this is the gap, this is the solution, this is the gap, this is the solution, that's helpful for the reviewers.
Thank you. Of the example grants that I've read, I hadn't seen any like that, so I wasn't sure if that was too unorthodox of an approach to take. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I like that.
All right. I guess we're going to say goodbye until we all see you at our virtual meeting, perhaps. But I don't think we have one set up for August, a webinar right now. And I was thinking about letting you guys work on your proposals, and then we'll start up again after the meeting. If I come up with something that's burning that we need to talk about in August, I may set up a webinar. But right now we don't have one for August. So everyone take a vacation and write your grants. Thank you, Heather. That was beautiful. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Good luck.